The black cleaning lady was humiliated by São Paulo's elite inside a gleaming mansion, treated like a joke amidst cruel laughter and crystal glasses. But when she raised her voice and revealed the truth she had kept hidden for decades, the entire room froze. What happened that night would forever change the destiny of everyone there and prove that dignity doesn't need a surname to shine. Subscribe to the channel to receive heartwarming stories every day. The night fell over the Upper East Side like a dark velvet cloak, covering the townhouses that gleamed like jewels set in the heart of Manhattan. Among them all, the Montebello mansion was the most imposing. Its wrought-iron gates guarded old secrets, and its illuminated windows reflected a world where money flowed like champagne, abundant, expensive, and out of reach for those who were born on the other side of the tracks. On this gala night, everything breathed luxury. Imported cars lined up, valets rushed back and forth, and women with diamonds around their necks laughed loudly, while men in Italian suits discussed business, politics, and power. Inside the ballroom, crystal chandeliers illuminated the space as if the heavens themselves had descended to bless the chosen few. And it was in this setting that Clarice Nascimento crossed the main entrance. She didn't arrive in a luxury car. She had no chauffeur. She wore no stilettos or designer dress. Clarice arrived by bus, got off 3 blocks before, and walked slowly to the entrance, clutching the small black purse that had belonged to her mother. She wore a simple navy blue dress sewn by her own hands. The fabric was clean, well-pressed, honest. And it was precisely this simplicity that started the snickers. When Clarice entered the ballroom, heads turned, not with admiration, with shock, with disdain. Murmurs spread across the tables like wildfire. Who is that woman? Isn't that Renato's housekeeper? What is she doing here? Clarice felt every gaze like a sharp blade cutting her skin, but she didn't lower her eyes. She didn't flinch. She knew exactly why she was there, and she also knew this night would not be forgotten. Renato Montebello, the night's host, stood at the center of the ballroom, tall, elegant, with the broad smile of someone who had never had to fight for anything. He raised his champagne glass and lightly tapped it with a silver spoon, drawing everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice clear and full of confidence, "I want to introduce you to our special guest of the evening." The conversations ceased. Everyone looked at Renato, curious. He pointed to Clarice, the housekeeper. The silence lasted only a second, and then the laughter erupted. Guffaws echoed off the marble walls. Women covered their mouths with their hands, pretending to stifle their amusement. Men slapped each other on the back, amused by the host's audacity. Renato smiled victoriously, expecting to see Clarice melt in shame, flee through the door, disappear. But Clarice remained where she was. She looked at Renato with the same calm of someone who had weathered far worse storms. Her eyes shone, but not with tears, with something deeper, something Renato couldn't yet name. "May I say a few words, Mr. Renato?" she asked, her voice firm. Renato laughed again, finding the situation amusing. "Of course, Clarice. The stage is yours." He believed she would stumble over her words, that she would apologize, that she would vanish. But what happened next made the entire ballroom freeze. Clarice walked to the center of the room. Her steps were slow, measured, full of a dignity no expensive dress could buy. She stopped under the central chandelier, where the light fell on her like a divine spotlight. And then, from the pocket of her black purse, she pulled out an old photograph. The paper was yellowed with age, but the image was clear. It showed a young black woman with a bright smile, dressed simply, standing next to a man in an impeccable suit. He was smiling too, and everyone in the room recognized that face. It was the Montebello patriarch, Renato's father, deceased 25 years ago. The murmurs began again, but this time they weren't laughter. They were nervous whispers, exchanged glances, growing tension. Clarice held up the photo so everyone could see. "My mother," she said, her voice calm and firm. "Zelia Nascimento, a teacher, an honest woman, and the man beside her, Renato's father." She paused, and then added, "My father too." The silence that followed was deafening. Clarice Nascimento never asked for much from life. From childhood, she had learned that the world gave nothing for free to those born poor and black, but she had also learned from her mother that dignity was something no one could steal, as long as you chose to protect it. Her childhood was marked by the scent of bar soap and the sound of the sewing machine running late into the night. Mrs. Zelia sewed for others, washed clothes, cared for other people's children. She did whatever was necessary to keep her children fed and in school. Clarice was the eldest of three, and it was she who, at 10 years old, began helping her mother carry bundles of laundry to the riverbank. She remembered her mother's hands, strong, calloused hands, always smelling of coconut soap, hands that didn't tremble, hands that held the world without complaint. Zelia never spoke much about the past, but there was a photograph she kept inside her Bible, wrapped in tissue paper. Clarice saw it a few times, and each time her mother cried silently afterward. When Clarice was 16, Zelia fell ill. The body that had carried so much weight finally gave way. She died in a public hospital bed, holding her daughter's hand, asking for forgiveness for not leaving an inheritance. "You are my inheritance, Mom," Clarice whispered, her voice broken, and Zelia smiled and passed away. After the funeral, Clarice found the photo, and with it, a sealed envelope. Inside, a document, a paternity test, and a letter written by hand in Zelia's trembling script. The letter told everything: the forbidden love, the broken promise, the violent expulsion, the imposed silence, the shame carried alone. Clarice read it with a broken heart and decided that one day, when the right moment came, the truth would be told. But life offered no respite. She had to work, raise her siblings, study at night in crowded, noisy public schools. Clarice graduated as a nursing assistant, but the salary wasn't enough, so she cleaned houses on weekends, ironed clothes, cared for the elderly. At 28, she got a steady job, a housekeeper at the Montebello mansion. On her first day, as she crossed those iron gates, Clarice felt a pang in her chest. She knew who lived there. She knew the name that adorned the walls, the wines, the society pages. She knew that place held a piece of her history. But no one inside knew who she was, and Clarice preferred it that way, at least at first. For 2 years, she worked in silence. She cleaned the crystal chandeliers, polished the marble floors, organized the immense rooms. She saw Renato Montebello pass by without looking at her face. She saw his wife, Veronica, issue orders with a dry, disinterested voice. She saw the teenage children leave dirty glasses scattered around the house, never saying thank you. Clarice heard it all. Phone conversations, fights hidden behind closed doors, secrets whispered in empty hallways. She knew Renato was cheating on his wife. She knew Veronica pretended not to know. She knew that family's money was stained with old lies. But Clarice wasn't there to judge. She was there to survive. She woke up every day at 4 in the morning, took 2 buses, arrived at the mansion before sunrise, and left after everyone had already had dinner. She returned home exhausted, ate something quick, helped her younger siblings with their homework, and slept a few hours before the cycle began again. Sometimes, while scrubbing the floor of the main living room, Clarice would look at the portrait of the patriarch hanging on the wall, the man her mother had loved, the man who had abandoned her, the man who was her father. She felt anger, she felt sadness, but she also felt something strange, a kind of pity, because he had died without knowing her, without knowing he had a daughter who had inherited her mother's strength, her grandmother's dignity, the courage of generations of women who had resisted in silence. Clarice didn't want revenge. She just wanted the truth to exist, that her mother wouldn't be forgotten, that her name wouldn't be erased. And then, 3 months ago, the golden envelope arrived. It was delivered by Renato himself, with a smile she recognized instantly. A smile of mockery, of cruelty disguised as kindness. "Clarice," he said, extending the invitation, "you're invited to our charity gala. It's going to be an unforgettable night." She took the envelope without a word, and when he walked away, she heard his low laugh echo down the hall. That night, alone at home, Clarice opened the envelope. She read the invitation, and she understood everything. Renato wanted to make her a laughingstock. He wanted to humiliate her in front of the city's elite. He wanted to prove she was just a cleaner who would never belong in that world. But what Renato didn't know was that Clarice Nascimento carried something far more powerful than shame within her. She carried the truth, and the truth, sooner or later, always finds its way to the light. The Montebello mansion wasn't just large, it was strategically divided. Each room had its purpose, each hallway its function. And the people who lived there also occupied well-defined places. There were the owners, the staff, the distinguished guests, and the invisible ones. Clarice belonged to the last group. She worked alongside 3 other women. Donna Marlene, a 60-year-old woman who managed the kitchen, Joanna, 22, responsible for the laundry, and Sylvia, the housekeeper, who coordinated everything with an iron fist and a suspicious gaze. Sylvia had never liked Clarice. From day one, she treated her coldly. She gave curt orders, demanded quick results, and rarely offered thanks. Clarice never quite understood why. Perhaps it was envy, perhaps fear. Perhaps Sylvia sensed that Clarice carried something different, something that couldn't be controlled. "You think you're better than the others?" Sylvia once asked, as Clarice folded hand-embroidered tablecloths. Clarice looked up, surprised. "No, Mom. I'm just doing my job." "Then do it quietly," and Clarice obeyed, because she knew it wasn't worth fighting for scraps of respect in places where it had never existed. Donna Marlene, on the other hand, was kind. She saw Clarice like a daughter. She always saved a piece of cake, a piece of fruit, a warm cup of coffee. And on the hardest afternoons, when exhaustion weighed too heavily, Marlene would pull up a chair and say, "Sit here for a bit, girl." Nobody dies from resting 5 minutes. It was with Marlene that Clarice learned the house's secrets, who the family's true friends were, who only showed up out of self-interest, who was betraying whom, who was lying to whom. "This house has ghosts, Clarice," Marlene would say softly. "Not the scary kind, but the ones that hide shame." Clarice heard it all and kept it, not out of malice, but because she understood that knowledge was power, even for someone who had nothing. Renato Montebello was a man of appearances. He smiled for cameras, supported social causes, donated money to hospitals. But inside the house, he was cold, distant, arrogant. Veronica, his wife, was worse. She treated the staff like objects. She never called them by name. She referred to them as the kitchen girl, the laundry girl, the cleaner. And when something didn't go her way, she would yell, humiliate, despise. Clarice saw Veronica make Joanna cry 3 times in a month. She saw Marlene swallow insults in silence. She saw Sylvia lower her head and accept curses without complaint. And every time she witnessed these scenes, Clarice felt a knot in her throat. She wanted to react. She wanted to defend her colleagues. But she knew that if she did, she would lose her job, and she couldn't afford to lose it. Not with her siblings depending on her, not with the rent overdue, not with the electricity bill piling up. So Clarice cleaned, silently, with anger stored in her chest, with dignity etched on her face. But she observed, and she learned. She learned that Renato had mistresses, that Veronica pretended not to know because she depended on the social status the Montebello surname brought. She learned that the older son, Raphael, used drugs and that his parents paid to cover up scandals. She learned that the younger daughter, Isabella, suffered in silence, trapped in a gilded cage. And she learned, above all, that that family, built on lies, would never be happy. It was one October afternoon that Clarice overheard the conversation that would change everything. She was cleaning Renato's office. The door was ajar, and from the hallway, voices came. Renato was on the phone, and he was laughing. Yes, it'll be hilarious. I'm going to invite the cleaner to the gala. Can you imagine her face walking into the ballroom? Everyone will die laughing. The voice on the other end replied with something Clarice couldn't make out, but Renato's laughter rang clear. Exactly. She'll feel like a queen for a day, and we'll remind her who she really is. Clarice felt her heart race. Her hands trembled, but she continued cleaning, in silence. When Renato hung up and left the office, he passed by her without looking, as he always did. That night, Clarice went home earlier. She locked herself in her room. She took her mother's photo from the back of the drawer, and she cried. She cried for the humiliation that awaited her. She cried for the invisibility she carried. She cried for the mother who had died without justice. But amidst the tears, something shifted. Clarice wiped her eyes. She looked at Zalia's photograph, and she made a decision. If Renato wanted to make a mockery of her, so be it. But Clarice Nascimento would not be the punchline he expected. She would be the truth he never imagined facing. The official invitation arrived 2 weeks before the gala. It was delivered to the kitchen during lunch break by Sylvia, who tossed it onto the table with disdain. "This is for you," she said, not looking at Clarice. Donna Marlene frowned. "An invitation? For what?" Sylvia shrugged. "Ask the boss." Clarice picked up the golden envelope. She felt the weight of the expensive paper between her fingers. She opened it slowly and read, "You are cordially invited to the 15th Annual Montebello Family Charity Gala. Attire formal." Joanna let out a nervous laugh. "Formal? They want you to show up in a ball gown?" Marlene crossed her arms, suspicious. "This doesn't feel right." Clarice folded the invitation and tucked it into her apron pocket. "I'm going to accept." The two of them stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "Clarice," Marlene said, grabbing her arm, "they're going to humiliate you. This is a trap." "I know," Clarice's voice was firm, "but I'm going." And that's what she did. In the days that followed, Clarice worked in silence. But at night, at home, she sewed. She took the dress her mother had worn to her graduation, a navy blue dress, simple but well-tailored. She adjusted the seams, mended the stitches, pressed it with care. When she finished, she looked in the mirror. It wasn't haute couture. It didn't sparkle. It didn't boast luxury. But it had a story. It had dignity. It had Zelia, and that was enough. On the night of the gala, Clarice showered, fixed her hair into a low bun, and applied a subtle lipstick. She put on the blue dress, slipped on the black low-heeled pumps she'd bought on sale, grabbed her mother's handbag, and left her small apartment with her heart pounding, but her head held high. When she stepped off the bus and walked toward the mansion, the gates were open. Luxury cars streamed in. Photographers' flashes popped. Security guards checked the guest list. Clarice presented the invitation. The guard looked her up and down. He hesitated, but the name was there. "You can go in." And she entered. The ballroom was breathtaking. Chandeliers sparkled like stars, tables adorned with imported flowers, French champagne, canapés served on silver platters, and at the center of it all, Renato Montebello, surrounded by admirers. As Clarice entered, the conversations didn't stop immediately. But slowly, gazes began to turn toward her. First curiosity, then recognition, and then disdain. "Who is that?" "The housekeeper." "What is she doing here?" Renato turned, and when he saw Clarice, his face lit up, not with joy, with cruel satisfaction. He raised his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," His voice cut through the room like a sharp blade. "I'd like to introduce our special guest." All conversation ceased. The silence was immediate. Renato pointed at Clarice. "The housekeeper!" Laughter erupted, guffaws that echoed off the walls. Women giggled behind their hands. Men laughed openly. Veronica, beside her husband, smiled with satisfaction. Clarice felt every laugh like a punch, but she didn't flinch. Renato continued. "I thought it would be amusing to show you all that. Here, everyone has a place, even those who clean our bathrooms." More laughter, more humiliation, and it was at that moment that Clarice took her first step. She walked, slowly, steadily, unhurriedly, across the ballroom, past the tables, past the laughter, past the stairs, and she stopped at the center, beneath the main chandelier. Renato was still laughing, but something in his expression began to change. Because Clarice wasn't crying, she wasn't running, she wasn't ashamed, she was just standing there, upright, whole. "May I say a few words, Mr. Renato?" she asked, her voice calm. Renato hesitated, but his ego won out. "Of course. The stage is yours." And that's how Clarice Nascimento, the invisible woman, finally became impossible to ignore. She pulled the photograph from her bag and held it up for all to see. My mother, Zelia Nascimento, a teacher, an honest woman. Absolute silence. And the man beside her, Renato's father, my father too. The ballroom froze. The seconds that followed felt like an eternity. No one was laughing anymore. No one was whispering. The entire room seemed to have stopped breathing. Renato Montebello blinked twice, as if trying to process what he had just heard. His face, once alight with arrogance, was now pale. His hands gripped his champagne flute too tightly, his fingers turning white. Veronica took a step forward, her eyes wide, her mouth agape. "What did you say?" Clarice didn't break eye contact. "I said that this man," she gestured to the portrait of the patriarch hanging on the main wall, "is my father." Murmurs exploded, low but intense, like an electric current coursing through the room. Renato let out a nervous, forced laugh. "This is ridiculous." "It's the truth," Clarice replied calmly. "The truth?" Renato took a step forward, trying to regain control. "You show up here, at my house, in the middle of my party, and invent an absurd story to get attention. It's not a story." Clarice pulled another document from her bag, a yellowed paper, carefully folded. "It's a paternity test, done 27 years ago. Notarized?" She extended the paper. Renato didn't move. It was Veronica who snatched the document from Clarice's hands. She opened it, read it, and her face changed. "Renato," her voice came out trembling, "let me see that." He took the paper from his wife's hands, read it quickly, and then looked at Clarice with pure hatred. "This proves nothing." "It proves everything," Clarice retorted. "My mother never lied. She kept this document her entire life, because she knew that one day the truth would need to be told. Your mother was an opportunist." Renato spat the words. "She took advantage of my father, invented this farce to extort money." The entire room murmured, but Clarice didn't flinch. "My mother never asked for a penny," she said, her voice firm. "She was kicked out of the house she lived in. She was threatened. She was silenced. And she died poor, raising 3 children alone. But she never lost her dignity." "Dignity?" Renato laughed bitterly. "You talk about dignity dressed in that rag, walking in here as if you're entitled to anything." Clarice felt the sting of his words, but she didn't back down. "I am entitled to the truth and to my mother's memory." Renato took 2 steps toward her. He stood so close that Clarice could smell the whiskey on his breath. "You're just a housekeeper, and you're going to stay that way. You can leave now, before I call security." Clarice looked him in the eye, and she saw fear, fear disguised as anger. "I'll leave," she said calmly, "but the truth remains." And then she turned her back. The ballroom parted. No one was laughing now. Many averted their gaze. Some looked embarrassed, others curious. Clarice walked towards the exit, slowly, with the same dignity with which she had entered. But before crossing the threshold, she stopped. She turned one last time. "My name is Clarice Nascimento, daughter of Zelia Nascimento and granddaughter of Maria da Gloria. Women who cleaned, who cared, who sustained. Women who were never seen, but who always existed." She looked at Renato. "You can deny it. You can tear up this paper. You can throw me out, but you can't erase what is true." And she left. Outside, the night was cold. Clarice walked to the gate, past the security guards, crossed the street. And only then, far from prying eyes, she leaned against a tree and cried. She cried for the humiliation, for the pain, for her mother, for all that was never fair. But she also cried with relief, because for the first time in her life she had spoken the truth out loud, and no one could silence her anymore. Clarice did not return to the Montebello mansion, not because she was afraid, but because she knew that place would never be the same for her. And she would never be the same either. In the days following the gala, the city talked, and a lot. The news spread like wildfire, not through the official newspapers, but through whispers, through messages exchanged between friends, through the WhatsApp groups of the New York elite, through the gossip that travels faster than any headline. "Did you hear what happened at the Montebello party? The housekeeper said she's the old man's daughter. Do you think it's true? He was always a ladies' man." Renato tried to shut it down. He called lawyers. He threatened to sue anyone spreading slander. He made sure to appear at public events with his family, smiling for the cameras, showing that everything was under control. But inside, the house was crumbling. Veronica barely spoke to him. They slept in separate rooms. She started questioning everything, every trip, every meeting, every secret. Raphael, the eldest son, was furious, not at the possibility of having a sister, but at the public shame, at the stain on the family name. Isabella, the youngest daughter, said nothing, but her eyes showed something different, curiosity, perhaps even compassion. Meanwhile, Clarice returned to her routine. She took another job at a medical clinic. She cleaned offices, organized reception areas. She earned less. But she didn't care. She needed peace. And peace didn't come from money. It came from a clear conscience. Mrs. Marlene called her 3 times. She cried on the phone, said she missed her, said the house was empty without her, said Sylvia had been nervous, said Renato was impossible. "You did the right thing, dear," Marlene said, her voice choked. "Your mother would be proud." Clarice thanked her and hung up before she started crying too. But it was on a Friday afternoon, 4 weeks after the gala, that everything truly began to change. Clarice was at home, preparing dinner, when she heard the doorbell ring. She opened the door and froze. On the other side stood Isabella Montebello. The girl was 17, straight hair, brown eyes, delicate features. She wore jeans and a simple blouse, no designer labels, no luxury. "Hi," she said, her voice low. Clarice hesitated. "Hi. Can I come in?" Clarice looked around, confused, but stepped aside. Isabella entered, looked around, seemed uncomfortable, but not with the place, with herself. "How did you find me?" Clarice asked. "I got your address from the HR files at the house." "Sorry, I know it's intrusive." Clarice crossed her arms. "What do you want?" Isabella took a deep breath. "I wanted to know if it's true." "What?" "If you're my sister." Silence hung heavy between them. Clarice went to the table, picked up Zelia's photo and the document. She held them out to Isabella. The girl took them with trembling hands. She looked at the photo, read the paper, and when she finished, her hands trembled even more. "My grandfather. He did that." "He did," Clarice replied, without anger, just weariness. Isabella sat on the sofa, covered her face with her hands. "I always knew my family was fake, but I never imagined this." Clarice sat beside her. "It's not your fault. I know, but it hurts." They sat in silence for a few minutes. Then Isabella raised her face. "My father is trying to hide everything, but I don't think it's right." "And what are you going to do?" "I don't know, but I wanted you to know that I believe you." Clarice felt her eyes sting, but she held back tears. "Thank you." Isabella stayed a little longer. They talked about life, about Zelia, about what it meant to be a woman in such different worlds. When the girl left, Clarice stood by the window, watching her car disappear around the corner, and for the first time since the gala, she felt something she hadn't expected. Hope, because the truth, even when painful, had the power to unite those who should be together. 2 weeks after Isabella's visit, Clarice received a call. Unknown number. She answered cautiously. "Hello? Clarice Nascimento." The voice on the other end was male, formal. "Yes. My name is Dr. Augusto Fagundes. I am an attorney, and I represent the interests of the Montebello estate." Clarice felt her heart race. "What do you want?" "I would like to schedule a meeting. There are matters that need to be discussed, legal matters." Clarice hesitated, but she accepted. The meeting took place in an office in downtown Manhattan, an old building, marble stairs, heavy wooden doors. Clarice entered the room and found 3 people. Dr. Augusto, a man in his 60s, in a grey suit and thin-rimmed glasses. Renato Montebello, sitting with his arms crossed, his face grim. And Isabella, standing by the window, her eyes red. "Please, have a seat." Dr. Augusto indicated a chair. Clarice sat. The lawyer opened a folder. He took out documents, spread them on the table. "Ms. Clarice, we have examined the paternity test you presented, and it is legitimate." Renato clenched his fists. Dr. Augusto continued. "This means that legally you are entitled to a portion of the inheritance left by the patriarch." Clarice blinked, surprised. "I didn't come here for money." "I know," the lawyer said gently, "but the law is clear, and your right exists." Renato exploded. "This is an outrage. She appears out of nowhere 30 years later and wants to take what's ours." "It's not ours, Father," Isabella said, her voice firm. "It's hers too." Renato looked at his daughter as if she had betrayed him. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly." Isabella turned to Clarice. "I'm sorry for everything." Clarice felt a lump in her throat, but she just nodded. Dr. Augusto sighed. "Mr. Renato, we need to resolve this civilly. Ms. Clarice has proof, she has rights, and if we take this to court, the exposure will be much greater." Renato fell silent. He knew the lawyer was right. "How much does she want?" he asked finally with disdain. Clarice stared at him. "I don't want money." Everyone looked at her, surprised. "Then what do you want?" Renato asked, confused. "I want my mother's name cleared. I want you to publicly acknowledge that she wasn't an opportunist, that she was wronged, that she deserved respect." Renato laughed sarcastically. "You want me to humiliate my family over a woman who doesn't even exist anymore?" "She existed, and she was erased like so many others." Clarice stood up. "I didn't come here for an inheritance. I came for justice. Not the kind from courts, the kind from the soul." She looked at Isabella. "Thank you for believing in me." And she left. But the story didn't end there. 3 days later, Isabella posted something on social media. An old photo, Zelia next to the patriarch, and a caption, "This is Zelia Nascimento, a teacher, a mother, a woman silenced by my family. Today, I acknowledge the injustice, and I ask for forgiveness." The post went viral. Newspapers published articles. TV shows commented. The elite who had laughed at the gala were now whispering shamefacedly, and Renato, for the first time in his life, was forced into silence. Because the truth, when spoken by someone with courage, is impossible to erase. 6 months passed since the night of the gala. Clarice continued her life. She worked at the medical clinic, cared for her siblings, paid the bills, smiled when she could, cried when she needed to. but something inside her had changed. She no longer carried that weight. The truth had been spoken. Her mother had been honored, and that was enough. Isabella visited her now and then. They had coffee together, talked about life, about dreams, about what it meant to be free. The young woman had decided not to follow in her father's footsteps. She wanted to study law, to defend people like Clarice, invisible people, forgotten people. And Clarice saw in her the hope that the world could change, little by little. Person by person, Renato never apologized, but he stopped denying, and that, in a way, was something. On a sunny Sunday morning, Clarice went to the cemetery. She brought white flowers, cleaned the headstone, sat on the grass beside Zelia's grave. "Hi, Mom," she whispered with a half-smile. "I came to tell you. I did it. I told the truth." And the world listened. The wind blew softly, rustling the leaves of the trees. Clarice closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she felt peace. She knew life would continue to be hard, that she would still scrub floors, that she would still take crowded buses, that she would still face sideways glances. But now, when she looked in the mirror, she would see something different. She would see a woman who didn't stay silent, a woman who honored her mother, a woman who proved that dignity doesn't need a last name to shine. Because true brilliance isn't found in gold, in jewelry, or in crystal chandeliers. It's in the courage to be who you are, even when the whole world says you are nothing. And that's how that simple woman, who only wanted respect, showed that true brilliance isn't in gold, but in the soul. And you, what did you think of this story? What lesson did it leave you with? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. That way, you won't miss any of our everyday heartwarming stories.